Hey guys, it's Snowbiter, and this is a replay I had with the Strv 103b on steps. Now, if you look at the matchup for this replay, you'll notice that this is actually a pretty old replay. It's from several patches ago, back before the matchmaker changes and the changes to RD and light tanks were implemented. I had initially been planning on making a commentary for this replay a while ago, but once that patch came out with all those changes, I stopped playing the Strv, so I held off on making this commentary. But now that I started playing the Strv again more recently, I figured I would go ahead and finally make this commentary because I think this replay is a pretty good example of what the Strv does well and what you can do to play it effectively. So I thought it would be useful to post. Now, I think it's pretty safe to say that the Strv has by far one of the more unique playing styles in World of Tanks, partly because of siege mode and partly because its armor is entirely dependent on overmatch mechanics. Generally, any tank with a gun that's 120 millimeters or less is pretty likely to bounce off you if they're shooting at your frontal armor. Whereas anything above 120 millimeters, you should expect to be able to pen you pretty consistently. So you really have to think carefully about how you position yourself and which tanks you expose yourself to. And you'll see that come into play a bit in this replay. Anyway, from the south spawn on steps, really with most tank destroyers, I usually just play the ridge around G7 near my team's cap circle. The Strv can actually be a pretty decent passive scout, so sometimes I'll try going to that spotting bush that's around F6 or so. But in a matchup like this, where there are multiple scouts, I decided that making that play was probably a bit too risky, so I'm just going to play passive here at the start of the game. That rock around E7 is a pretty popular spot for light tanks to go to, so what I often like to do is I'll pre-aim that position and see if I can get a shot into any of the scouts that might be trying to get to that rock. And so sure enough, I get a shot into that Type 62 before he's able to get into cover. Since I didn't get lit when I actually took that first shot, I decided to inch forward a little bit there and get those tanks that were crossing toward the 9 line into my draw range. And so I was able to put a second shot into the IS-7. Although that time I do get lit, so I make sure there to reverse behind this rock so that none of the tank destroyers on the opposite side can get any shots into me. Generally speaking, tank destroyers are the tanks that you have to watch out for the most because they usually carry the highest caliber guns, and so they're the biggest threat to actually overmatching your armor and damaging you. So I took one blind shot in that bush in case the Type 62 was trying to peek from behind the rock. But then I saw this 1390 pushing up the mid-road, so I decided to move over to get some shots into him. And this is where you can see the siege mode can be kind of awkward to deal with this tank. I took a really wide angle at first before entering siege mode because I wanted to force the 1390 to engage me. But he almost immediately decides to circle me, and I end up whiffing that first shot as I'm traversing. Fortunately, though, I'm able to get one shot into him as he tries to run away, so it wasn't a complete waste of an opportunity. But even in that kind of low-stress engagement, you can see how awkward this tank can be sometimes when you're trying to deal with the siege mode at close range. I actually think I bounced the shot as well from somewhere near the enemy base, so I was kind of lucky in that situation not to lose any HP. Now, the enemy is pushing pretty aggressively down the 8-9 line, but they haven't quite gotten close to our base, so I wanted to try to get back into this bush and see if I could get some shots off as they're trying to close the distance. So I put one shot into that Mutz who was peeking over the ridge, and then the Type 62 is moving up, so I get another shot into him. I'm looking for kill shots, but unfortunately he gets behind cover. And I see this room out in the open, so I'm going to just try to expose as little of my tank as possible. You do have to be really careful about how you angle, because if you give any of your side to really any tank, it's pretty easy to pen this tank in the side. So I get a couple shots into that Roomba, but now the enemy's pretty much cleared out everything that we have on the 8-9 line, and they're getting kind of close enough to the point where I'm starting to feel uncomfortable. I don't really want to be the front lines facing all those tanks, so I just had to reverse back. I can still cover my base from a pretty good distance over in this direction, so I'm not worried about getting capped out. But I want to make sure that there's no chance of anybody getting on my side or anybody really getting close enough so that they could potentially hit that weak spot on the top of my tank. So I reverse back, I take advantage of the really high reverse speed that this tank has. And I'm just going to try to set up and put some shots into these tanks as they continue to push and cross into the open, or cross out in the open. I get penned once there and I get a couple of shots off, but the tanks I'm shooting at are pretty hull down, so I don't really have great shots in this situation, and there are enough tanks shooting at me that I don't really want to test the armor too much, and so I decided to reverse back even more. And I'm also worried about that bad shot trying to flank me. I want to avoid getting flanked at all costs. At first I was thinking I would maybe go up into that hill that's kind of around K5 or K6, but I decided that that was even a little too isolated from the rest of my team. I wanted to stay close to my team, so I decided to fall back even more. And got lucky there, as that Sen AX didn't actually hit me. It could have gotten penned in that situation. Now, it looked like the Patton and 215B were going to push down the K line, so I decided to stop and set up to get some shots into them. And since I know that neither of them has a gun that's over 120 millimeters, because of that I can basically just sit here and I don't have to worry about taking any damage. And they don't seem to realize that they really have no hope of penning me, because they're kind of just sitting out in the open. And because of that, I can just basically take advantage of my DPM and mow them down. And this is where you can see how good the gun is on this tank. If you're allowed to actually just shoot consistently, the DPM on this tank is really incredible. So even though I missed, or I had a couple of no damage shots on that Patton, I'm able to take him out pretty quickly. Now this Sen AX wants to try to shoot me, and I'm trying to kill him, but unfortunately bounce a few times off his turret. But at this point, my teammates have all turned around, so now I have a lot of support from the left side, and there's really nothing these two guys can do. But this is, I think, really the ideal situation for this tank, where you can kind of play defensively and force enemy tanks to push into you, and especially if you can position yourself so that you're facing tanks with lower caliber guns who are probably going to bounce off your frontal armor. This tank can be really effective. You saw how in this replay the enemy pushed really aggressively through the east of the map, so I was on the defensive pretty much since the beginning of the replay, but since I was able to keep my distance while still keeping my gun active, I was able to buy time for the rest of my team to clean up the 1-2 line and then turn around and help me finish off the tanks that were kind of pushing through our base. The game could have gone maybe a little differently if the enemy had tried capping or getting on cap and putting cap pressure on, because I backed off pretty far away from the cap circle. But I still had enough HP that I probably could have taken on if any enemy tanks had continued to push forward. I could have out DPM'd anything that pushed forward and then gotten resets. So I think I probably still would have won this game. Anyway, this replay is pretty much finished. It's just a matter of chasing down this bad chat who's trying to run away from us. But anyway, I mean, I think really the key to playing this tank is, even though the front armor can be really strong, you can't always guarantee that, or it's not always a guarantee that you're able to avoid tanks with higher caliber guns. So you're much better off to the extent that you can just expose yourself as little as possible in general, whether that means kind of playing at long range out of the view range of the tanks that you're shooting at, or utilizing camo so that you just don't get lit. Or you know, if it's not really a long range map, trying to take advantage of the gun depression on this tank can work really well, because you can expose very little of your tank to get shots on the enemy. Where this tank gets really difficult to play is when you're trying to push in enemy tanks, or when you're trying to kind of play peekaboo around corners, because that's where dealing with siege mode can be a big issue. Anyway, I'm finally able to catch up to this bad chat, and I make sure to track him so that he can't keep running away. And I get to farm a little bit of extra damage here at the end of the game. So there's the final kill. I end up with 4 kills on the game. And now I'll show you the post-game stats. So this game wasn't quite good enough for an ace tanker. I only got a first class badge, but I did about 7.7k damage, so a pretty solid game with the Strv. And got quite a few medals. This was one of those rare games where the armor I was able to really take full advantage of it. I got a steel wall and a cool-headed and blocked over 5k damage. So you can see how effective the armor can be in the right situation with this tank. But anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this replay and the commentary, and maybe gave you a bit of a sense of how I like to approach playing the Strv. So thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys later.